writing to the media, he would indicate in one letter, he said, "I am the son of Sam," and that one phrase was taken, and he was named as a result of that. Very different from the normal predator type, even though that these crimes were sexually motivated. There was a kind of a foundation of sexual motivation here. The fact is that there was no sexual contact. Berkowitz shot and killed his victims at a distance using a high-powered revolver. And in fact, the sexual satisfaction came from the fantasies that Berkowitz played out before and after the crimes occurred. Berkowitz, I think, realizing that he was on thin ice and was heading for a collision with these crimes, planned to end the crimes by an event of mass murder, to take out a number of young people in a discotheque during the time that they're in there dancing and being entertained. He would attack them with an assault rifle and kill as many people as possible, possibly himself in the fray. That never happened. The police, in their investigation, stopped Berkowitz at the time that this was about to go down. One of the things that came to public attention in the David Berkowitz case was the fact that he had stated that he killed his victims because he was ordered by a talking dog to do these things. The dog was possessed by a 3,000-year-old demon who possessed the dog, and the dog would order him to kill. This is the kind of thing that the public at large likes to grab onto. In reality, when I talked to Berkowitz about this, he started talking about the talking dog giving him the orders to kill, and I'd indicated, David, I really came to see you and to get some answers from you. If it's the dog that we're concerned with here, maybe I ought to pursue the dog and interview the dog. At this point, Berkowitz kind of smiled, and he kind of looked down, and then he looked up and he said, well, it did justify my acts, because my acts were crazy, and that explanation satisfied a lot of people. I think when anybody thinks in terms of a serial killer, Theodore Robert Bundy probably comes to mind. This was the first of the real classic cases of serial homicide that I think brought everybody's attention to serial murder in the U.S. Many of the things about Bundy's murders have become almost a standard for the media, in particular the entertainment media's impression of a serial killer. White, male, late 20s, early 30s, educated, articulate, intelligent, and of course many of the ideas of what a serial killer is have been taken from his case, and in fact are not always accurate. The idea that all victims look the same of a serial killer was very true. In Bundy's case, is not true in most cases. But Bundy was an individual who had a early childhood that would be consistent with that of a person that would commit violent crimes and serial offenses later in life. And he was truly a very highly organized sexual sadist and sexual psychopath who had intellectually decided that the way to gain sexual experiences of his liking was merely to take what he wanted and when he wanted it. Ted Bundy was probably one of the most organized serial killers that I think have really been studied. He was methodical. He would pick up a victim in a remote location and oftentimes transport her as much as 100 miles to, again, distance himself from police investigations. He became almost compulsive in the way he would try to cover his tracks. Interesting thing was, in his last crimes, when in fact he had been declared a fugitive by the FBI, when he was on the FBI's top 10 list, he slowly began to break down, and we saw that very compulsive, organized type offender losing his control, losing his organization, and about the time that he did the Chi Omega murders in the sorority house in Florida, and the final last victim, Kimberly Leach, the little 12-year-old girl, Bundy almost traversed the scale from highly organized down to a fairly disorganized personality. I think he was having a mental setback, and his capture was a result of that. Chikatilo was an individual who, again, was not insane by the legal definition, certainly not a well man, but at the same time, he was very organized. He seemed to have a pattern. He stayed one step ahead of the law throughout the entire adventure of 53 homicides. But again, we have to really take that number with a grain of salt. It's very possible it could be more. It could be quite a few less, but a number of people were jailed and even executed that were charged with crimes later attributed to Chikatilo. Although the courts found Dahmer to be guilty as charged, I personally feel that Dahmer was mentally ill, not so severely so that he would be read by a psychiatrist as being psychotic, but from the standpoint that I see Dahmer as a new wave type, new era type serial killer, very bizarre, almost psychotic type fantasies, at the same time carrying off their crimes in a very organized fashion. But his crimes really were very much of a predator serial killer, going out and stalking, cruising the bars, the gay bars, and picking up victims and taking them back to his home. Dahmer could not deal with a living human being. When in fact an individual wanted to leave him, Dahmer became very, very upset, and that led to him drugging his victims and eventually killing them while they were drugged. Afterwards, Dahmer would keep the bodies. There were acts of necrophilia, there were acts of cannibalism, there were acts of dismemberment. All sorts of bizarre things occurred, and his crimes were stimulated by very bizarre sex and violence videos that he would watch compulsively. In the bottom line, Dahmer told me that he was aware of the fact that he did not belong in our society, and he was relieved at the idea that he would spend the rest of his life in incarceration. And of course he was killed by another inmate in prison, in the very prison where he probably didn't belong. Gacy was a very organized, a very methodical serial killer. He was definitely mentally intact. There was no evidence of any mental disorder, but he was definitely a sadistic psychopath and somewhat of a pedophile, in that his intended victims, his preferred victims, were young adolescent males. During the 5 years that Gacy operated and killed these 33 young men, he traveled to 14 states throughout the United States, and very likely Gacy was involved in homicides in those 14 states as well. In asking Gacy about the possibility of other homicides, Gacy always played a lot of games, made a lot of jokes, in fact even sent me a painting on one occasion where on the back of the painting he made the statement to Bob Ressler, before you can expect to reap the harvest, you have to be prepared to dig in the fields. And in that little statement, Gacy was challenging me to find other victims of his crimes. I think Gacy killed more than 33. Right up until the time he was executed in May of 1994, Gacy minimized his involvement in the crimes, indicated that others were involved in the crimes with him, and I think that may be a possibility, but never would admit to murdering all 33. Murdered several, as he would say, but would never really be very specific. And I think in his own way, his sadism, his sexual sadism, more or less forced him to take even that secret to the grave, to continue his harassing of society at large. Ed Gein was an individual who was mentally disturbed, probably suffered from what we would call today childhood schizophrenia. His only associates were really his older brother, his mother, and his father. It was a case of a mentally dysfunctional individual being kept in the home, and when the brother died, when the mother died, when the father died, and all three were gone, leaving Gein to his own designs in his 50s. Gein now was really a emotional child in some respects, with fantasies, sexual urges that he didn't understand, and it has been determined that he suffered a lifetime of schizophrenia. He went to grave sites, dug up victims, took them to his house, carried out sexual rituals, cut the bodies up, made various items, lampshades, and items of clothing out of human body parts, and this satisfied him for a while until he started going after living victims. And after the third victim, Gein was caught. When Gein was captured, he seemed to be almost unaware of why the police were arresting him. He did not equate his murders and his crimes to his arrest. He died in a mental institution. You're dealing here with just two sexual psychopaths that had similar fantasies, similar ideas, and in their relationship, actually being related, the individuals had come upon the idea that they could derive a lot of pleasure and a lot of satisfaction and a lot of good times by teaming up and getting victims, sexually assaulting the victims to their taste, and of course then disposing of their victims. The The murder victims were discarded, many of them on the hillsides of Los Angeles, which therefore, again, the media came up with the title of Hillside Strangler. The media has a way of giving these people credibility, and of course the two of them, I think, thrived on that. They would actually pull up to young women on the street, prostitutes, things of that nature, and identify themselves as police officers and caution them to be careful because the Hillside Strangler was around, and get into the car, and we don't want you out here alone. It was actually a way of getting victims. They turned their publicity into a ploy for getting victims. They were sadistic. They were very, very cruel, and considerable torture and suffering went along with their crimes. By today's standards, Jack was not that prolific. He was an individual who only killed 5 women, but the patterns that were spotted in that case are very typical and could be very easily read today. And from the very destructive nature of the homicides, the tremendous evisceration, dismemberments, beheadings, things of that nature, you could tell that this individual was disorganized and becoming even more so as the crimes went on. There have been historians that have looked at various suspects ranging from royalty. In one individual was a medical doctor, and on the far end of the scale of suspects was kind of a disordered individual. And if I had my perceptions there, I would probably look at that disorganized individual as being the most likely suspect. A medical doctor I don't see as doing the chop jobs that were done on these victims. A person of royalty certainly would have been more organized. If not, he probably would have been in a mental institution. Henry Lee Lucas was the more dominant of the pair. The fact is that he teamed up with an individual, Otis Toole, who was less intelligent, and where Toole would almost fall into the category of a disorganized offender, I think Henry Lee Lucas was organized and quite street smart. When caught, Henry Lee Lucas would confess to first 100 and then 200 and then 300 and beyond. I think the count got up to 350. Otis Toole claimed 60 or more homicides himself. I interviewed Lucas many, many years after he was incarcerated in the Texas Department of Corrections. Lucas admitted that he had false confessed to a number of crimes, did admit some murders, but claimed they were nowhere beyond a reasonable number, and he wouldn't discuss that number. But he said he did this because the police were fools, and he just wanted to make them look foolish as possible. The crimes that that resulted from Lucas and Toole probably number 10, 15, 20. It's really hard to say. Manson was not a serial killer. Manson was not even a mass murderer. Manson was not a spree killer. Manson himself has never been known to kill anybody. But the fact is that Manson orchestrated some very, very disastrous events, in particular the Tate LaBianca murders. He wasn't particularly organized, but he certainly wasn't a disorganized individual. He suffered no known psychosis until he went to jail when he showed signs of schizophrenia. But while operating on the outside, Manson was a con man, just a slick psychopath that was using a bunch of young kids to feather his own bed and to make his life easier. Some very brutal attacks were taking place by an individual who was merely described as a Hispanic-looking male with bad teeth by some of the victims that lived. The type of crime that he would commit, for example, he'd break in, kill the parents, and abduct a young girl and sexually assault the young girl, leaving her barely alive. Another one, he just crashed into a house and shot and killed 2 young women who were living together in a residence. He was breaking into churches. He seemed to be on a rampage. Richard Ramirez was actually caught because the LAPD and the LASO had focused their investigation through fingerprint evidence on one Richard Ramirez. That information was made available to the public, and the public at large literally spotted Ramirez on the street and chased him down, apprehended him, made citizens arrests, and the police came just in time to avoid the police action by the civilians that was taking place that may have led to the death of Ramirez. He was being beaten quite badly. In fact, he begged the police to take him into custody to get him away from the mob of citizens that had apprehended him. And In reality, Ramirez was, I feel, again, a mixed type offender. He certainly was far from organized. He had some organized attributes, but at the same time, he did have some very psychotic thoughts, and in fact was caught up in the concept of that he was some disciple of Satan and that he was doing the devil's work, which may just have been a rationalization for his crimes. By today's standards, Jack was not that prolific. He was an individual who only killed 5 women, but the patterns that were spotted in that case are very typical and could be very easily read today. And from the very destructive nature of the homicides, the tremendous evisceration, dismemberments, beheadings, things of that nature, you could tell that this individual was disorganized and becoming even more so as the crimes went on. There have been historians that have looked at various suspects ranging from royalty. In one individual was a medical doctor, and on the far end of the scale of suspects was kind of a disordered individual. And if I had my perceptions there, I would probably look at that disorganized individual as being the most